August 28, 1833, a hushed chamber in London's Palace of Westminster, where the air is thick with the scent of polished wood and ink. Members of Parliament, weary from months of debate, rise as King William IV's ascent is proclaimed. The Slavery Abolition Act has passed, a document forged in fire and fervor, declaring that from August 1, 1834, slavery shall cease in Britain's colonies. Cheers erupt, but tempered by the knowledge of compromises. Apprenticeships for the formerly enslaved, and £20 million in compensation, not to the victims, but to their owners. In the galleries, abolitionists like Thomas Fowell Buxton clasp hands, their eyes glistening. Outside, news spreads through fog-shrouded streets, reaching taverns where former slaves toast freedom's dawn. This is no simple law. It's the climax of a half-century crusade, toppling an empire built on human bondage, inspiring global movements, and exposing the moral costs of progress. Welcome to Vestige Files, where we unearth the pivotal moments that shaped history. This is the story of the abolition of slavery in Britain, a saga of conscience, commerce, and courage that dismantled an institution as old as empire itself. To grasp this transformative victory, we must rewind to the 17th century, when Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade began to weave a web of wealth and woe. In the 1600s, England lagged behind Portugal and Spain in colonial ventures, but the Restoration under Charles II in 1660 ignited ambition. The Royal African Company, granted a monopoly in 1672, shipped enslaved Africans to plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and Virginia, fueling the triangular trade: European goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, sugar, tobacco, and cotton back to Britain. By the 18th century, Britain dominated, transporting over 3.1 million Africans, half the total trade, via ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London. Forts along Africa's Gold Coast, such as Cape Coast Castle, became grim warehouses where captives endured branding, chains, and the horrors of the Middle Passage. Voyages lasting 6 to 8 weeks, with mortality rates up to 20% from disease, suicide, or brutality. Survivors toiled on sugar estates, where life expectancy was a mere 7 to 10 years amid whippings, amputations, and family separations. Profits soared, sugar-sweetened British tea, cotton-fed Lancashire mills, and slave-derived wealth built mansions like Harewood House for the Lascelles family. By 1770, Britain produced 40% of Europe's sugar, its economy intertwined with slavery. Banks like Barclays financed voyages, insurers covered cargo losses. Yet cracks formed. Enlightenment ideals from John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau emphasized natural rights, clashing with bondage. Religious awakenings like Methodism under John Wesley condemned slavery as sin. Early challengers emerged. In 1727, Quakers in Pennsylvania, led by John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, denounced slavery, influencing British friends. Granville Sharp, a London clerk born in 1735, took up the cause after encountering Jonathan Strong, an escaped slave beaten near death in 1765. Sharp secured Strong's freedom and in 1772 won the landmark Somerset case. Lord Mansfield ruled that James Somerset, brought to England, could not be forcibly returned to the colonies, effectively barring slavery on British soil, though not in the empire. Sharp's efforts inspired others. Olaudah Equiano, born around 1745 in what is now Nigeria, was kidnapped at 11, enslaved in Virginia and the Caribbean, and bought his freedom in 1766. Settling in London, he published the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano in 1789, a bestseller detailing Middle Passage atrocities, humanizing the enslaved and boosting abolitionism. Josiah Wedgwood, the potter and industrialist, crafted the iconic 1787 medallion, a kneeling enslaved man in chains inscribed, "Am I not a man and a brother?" worn as brooches by supporters. Women joined. Hannah More, a playwright and evangelical, wrote anti-slavery poems. Elizabeth Herrick, a Leicester Quaker, penned "Immediate Not Gradual Abolition" in 1824, demanding swift end. The organized movement crystallized in 1787, Thomas Clarkson, a Cambridge graduate born in 1760, won a prize for his essay on slavery, then rode 35,000 miles gathering evidence, interviewing sailors, collecting irons and thumbscrews as exhibits. With Sharp and 10 others, mostly Quakers like William Dillwyn, they formed the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Enter the Clapham sect, evangelical Anglicans based in Clapham, London. Henry Thornton, banker, Zachary Macaulay, former Jamaican overseer turned abolitionist, and William Wilberforce, the charismatic MP, born in 1759. Converted by Wesley Wilberforce, elected to Parliament at 21, became the movement's parliamentary voice after Clarkson convinced him in 1787. Backed by Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, Wilberforce introduced his first abolition bill in 1788, but defeat followed. Economic interests lobbied fiercely, arguing slavery's necessity for trade. The French Revolution in 1789 and Haitian Revolt in 1791, led by Toussaint Louverture, stoked fears of uprisings delaying progress. Yet public support grew. Petitions flooded Parliament, with 519 in 1792 alone, signed by over 400,000. Boycotts of slave sugar involved 300,000 households. By 1804, momentum shifted. Denmark banned its trade in 1792. The U.S. followed in 1807. Wilberforce's bills passed the Commons repeatedly, but failed in the Lords until Napoleon's wars weakened pro-slavery arguments. On February 23, 1807, the Slave Trade Act passed, abolishing the British slave trade from March 1, 1808. Celebrations ensued, but slavery persisted. Existing enslaved people remained bound, and illegal trade continued via smugglers. The African Institution, founded in 1807 with Clarkson as secretary, monitored enforcement, while the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron, established in 1808 under Captain Philip Beaver, patrolled coasts, freeing 150,000 over decades, but at high cost. 5,000 sailors died from disease. Still, abolitionists pressed for full emancipation. Wilberforce, health failing, retired in 1825, passing the torch to Thomas Fowell Buxton, an MP and brewer born in 1786, who formed the Anti-Slavery Society in 1823. The push for abolition intensified amid economic shifts and revolts. Britain's Industrial Revolution, powered by cotton from American slaves, paradoxically eroded Caribbean plantations' profitability. Soil exhaustion, competition from beet sugar, and free trade doctrines under Adam Smith's influence questioned protectionist duties. Yet planters, represented by the West India Interest Lobby, fought back, claiming ruin without slavery. In Parliament, debates raged. Pro-slavery MPs like George Hibbert argued enslaved people were content, citing biased reports. Abolitionists countered with testimonies. Mary Prince, a Bermudian enslaved woman, published her narrative in 1831, exposing floggings and separations, the first by a black woman in Britain. Women's groups amplified. The Birmingham Ladies' Society for the Relief of Negro Slaves, founded in 1825, raised funds and petitioned, collecting 187,000 signatures by 1833. Slave revolts ignited urgency. In Demerara, Guyana, in 1823, 10,000 enslaved people, led by Kwamina and inspired by missionary John Smith, rose for freedom. Crushed by troops, 250 killed. Smith died in prison. In Jamaica, the 1831 to 1832 Baptist War, sparked by Sam Sharp, a Baptist deacon born around 1801, involved 60,000 enslaved across plantations. Sharp, literate, and influenced by abolition news, planned a peaceful strike post-Christmas, but violence erupted. 14 whites killed, hundreds of enslaved executed, including Sharp hanged in 1832. His last words, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." The revolt cost £1.4 million in property, shocking Britain and exposing slavery's instability. Newspapers like The Times shifted support, arguing abolition prevented further bloodshed. Politically, the 1832 Reform Act transformed Parliament, expanding electorate from 400,000 to 650,000, empowering middle-class abolitionists and reducing rotten boroughs controlled by planters. The Whig government under Charles Grey, 2nd Earl Grey, elected in 1830, pledged reform. Buxton introduced an emancipation motion in 1831, forming a select committee that heard harrowing evidence. Clarkson, now 71, testified on abuses. But Grey's ministry hesitated, fearing economic fallout. Edward Stanley, later Earl of Derby, colonial secretary, drafted the bill. Compromises emerged: immediate freedom for children under 6, apprenticeships for others, 12 years for field workers, later reduced to 6 and 4 amid outcry, and compensation to owners, calculated by value of enslaved. Planters demanded it. Abolitionists like Joseph Sturge of the Agency Committee, founded in 1831, pushed for immediatism via nationwide lectures. Debates in 1833 were fierce. On May 14, Stanley presented the bill in the Commons, an act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies, for promoting the industry of the manumitted slaves, and for compensating the persons hitherto entitled to the services of such slaves. Opponents like William Ewart Gladstone's father, John Gladstone, a planter owning 2,500 enslaved, argued bankruptcy loomed. Buxton criticized apprenticeships as slavery under another name, proposing amendments. Petitions poured in, 1.3 million signatures, including 187,000 from women in one day. The Lords, planter-heavy, resisted, but Grey threatened peer creations. On July 24th, the Commons passed the third reading 180-40. The Lords followed on August 7th. William IV, reluctant, assented August 28, 1833. Days before his death would have voided it. Joy mixed with bitterness. £20 million, equivalent to £17 billion today, compensated 46,000 owners, with figures like John Gladstone receiving £106,769 for 2,508 enslaved. No reparations for the enslaved. Implementation brought conflict. On August 1, 1834, 800,000 were freed in the Caribbean, Cape Colony, and Mauritius. Celebrations erupted. In Antigua, full emancipation without apprenticeship. In Jamaica, midnight vigils with hymns. But apprenticeships sparked resistance. Stipendiary magistrates like Richard Hill in Jamaica reported abuses, low wages, 9 pence per day, and continued floggings. The system meant to civilize workers failed amid strikes. Buxton and Sturge lobbied. In 1838, Parliament ended apprenticeships early on August 1st, granting full freedom. Yet economic hardships persisted. Ex-slaves, landless, worked for former owners at poverty wages, fueling migrations and unrest. The 1833 Act resolved Britain's legal ties to slavery, but its echoes reverberated. Domestically, it bolstered moral authority. Britain positioned as liberator, expanding the West Africa Squadron to 36 ships by 1840, suppressing trade via treaties with African leaders, and seizures of 1,600 vessels by 1860. Economically, sugar production dipped 10 to 20% initially, but recovered via indentured labor from India, over 450,000 to Caribbean by 1917, and China, creating new exploitations. The compensation funded railways, banks, and estates. David Cameron's ancestors received £4,000. The Treasury repaid the loan only in 2015. For the formerly enslaved, freedom brought agency. In Jamaica, they built free villages, like Sligoville with missionary aid, establishing schools and churches. Figures like Mary Seacole, born free in 1805 but impacted by the era, rose as entrepreneurs. Globally, the act inspired abolition. In France, slavery ended in 1848 amid revolution, the U.S. in 1865 via the 13th Amendment after Civil War. Brazil persisted until 1888. British pressure via the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty with the U.S. An 1839 Amistad case, won by John Quincy Adams, advanced the cause. In Africa, it spurred missionary work. David Livingstone's explorations from 1841 aimed to replace slave trade with commerce and Christianity. Yet hypocrisy lingered. The East India Company territories exempted until 1843, Forced labor in India under coolie systems mirrored slavery. The Act's moral force fueled Chartism and labor rights in Britain, with abolitionists like Buxton advocating prison reform. Human costs were immense. Enslaved like Equiano and Prince endured lifetimes of trauma. Revolters like Sharp and Quamina paid with lives. Clarkson, touring until 1846, died that year at 86, honored by 200 freed slaves at his funeral. Wilberforce passed July 29, 1833, days after the bill's passage, whispering "Thank God" upon hearing. Buxton continued, founding the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society in 1839, today Anti-Slavery International. Legacies divide. Some hail Britain's pioneering role, others critique compensation and delayed justice, sparking reparations calls. CARICOM's 2013 demand for atonement from Europe. In 2007, Tony Blair expressed deep sorrow for the trade, but no apology. Museums like Liverpool's International Slavery Museum, opened 2007, educate on horrors. The abolition of slavery in Britain marked a moral watershed, proving public pressure could topple entrenched evil, yet revealed reform's limits. Freedom without equity bred new inequalities. Wilberforce, Clarkson, Equiano, their tireless fight showed humanity's capacity for change, but at what ongoing cost? Was the 1833 Act a genuine triumph of justice, or a compromised step that perpetuated exploitation in new forms? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this chronicle of chains broken moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to Vestige Files, and ring the bell for more stories of history's turning points.